A 65-year-old veteran in Ohio opened an envelope and discovered he was about to lose the dirt he had lived on for 20 years. He had paid off the land decades ago, but the county had just doubled his property assessment without warning. The local government wanted thousands in new property taxes instead of packing his bags and surrendering his property to the state. He drove down to a local salvage yard. He spent exactly $3,200 on a set of trailer axles and thick corrugated steel arches. Working alone, he bolted that heavy steel shell directly onto the wheels. When the county tax assessor showed up with a clipboard expecting to charge him, there was no concrete foundation to tax. To understand how bolted steel just legally beat the government, you need to see the terrifying scale of the property tax crisis displacing everyday Americans right now. Hook variant word count. Approximate 152-word block. Hook, 3 variants. According to property tax data from 2023, single-family home taxes surged by staggering margins. They reached a national average of nearly $4,100 per household. But in rapidly growing counties across states like Texas, Florida, and Idaho, the reality is much worse. Homeowners were hit with assessments that jumped 40, 50, or even 60% overnight. This is not a mortgage crisis. It is a tax crisis. Men and women who played by the rules and paid off their 30-year loans are now losing their land, all because they cannot afford the rent the government is charging them to keep it. You probably drive past someone in this exact situation more often than you realize. An old woman on a fixed income packing up a living room she has occupied since 1990. A working-class machinist holding an overdue notice, realizing the dirt he owns outright is about to be auctioned off by the county. They are not losing their homes to predatory banks. They are losing them to local tax assessors. Records show that in a typical year, roughly 80,000 American properties are seized strictly for unpaid property taxes. 80,000 front doors padlocked by the state, and a significant portion of those belong to retirees living on modest pensions. People who simply cannot absorb a sudden $3,000 increase in their annual tax bill. Keep in mind, this massive displacement is happening at the exact same time politicians are debating multi-billion-dollar housing relief programs. They stand at podiums announcing massive spending packages. They draft decade-long timelines. They hire consultants and form committees, while the problem only accelerates. But a man staring at a foreclosure notice cannot wait 3 years for a state committee to approve a new zoning blueprint. He needs a roof tonight. And while the government spent millions talking about the problem, something very different began happening at the ground level. Ordinary Americans realized that political relief was never going to arrive, so they stopped asking for permission. They looked at the very building codes and tax laws designed to trap them. They found one massive legal flaw hidden inside, and they started building a way out. What they built is the part that made the government furious. And while politicians have been debating billion-dollar housing programs, ordinary men with no government budgets and no fancy titles have been picking up wrenches, buying raw steel, mounting tires. They are fighting back using a piece of engineering that has been hiding in plain sight since the 1940s, the Quonset hut. During World War II, the military needed a shelter that was incredibly cheap and virtually uncrushable. It had to survive everything from South Pacific typhoons to Arctic blizzards. The design relies entirely on self-supporting corrugated steel arches. There are no heavy wooden beams to rot. There is no complex framing to measure. Just raw, curved strength. Strength that can be assembled by a few guys using basic hand tools. But the real genius is not just the steel itself. It is how these men are using that steel to mathematically beat the system. To understand the loophole, you have to look at the exact wording of local property tax codes. Across the country, building enforcement and tax assessments rely on one specific physical anchor, a permanent foundation, a poured concrete slab, deeply driven wooden pylons. If a structure is physically tied into the earth with rebar and cement, the government classifies it as a permanent improvement to the land. And permanent improvements mean the assessor gets to demand a cut every single year. So these builders simply stop pouring concrete. Instead of digging footings, they buy a heavy-duty flatbed trailer. They bolt the thick steel arches directly to the metal chassis. They keep the axles intact. They leave the rubber tires resting on the dirt. They register the base with the DMV, completely bypassing the local zoning board. By doing this, the shelter legally remains a vehicle. Under the eyes of the law, it is classified as chattel, not real estate. The county cannot levy a property tax on a permanent dwelling if the dwelling technically isn't permanent. For anywhere between $1,500 and $3,000 in salvage materials, a man can construct a stormproof, insulated home. And because it sits on a set of wheels, the local tax assessor is legally powerless to add a single dollar to property roll. It is an entirely legal loophole built out of steel and rubber. But theory is one thing. To see how much power this actually gives a working man, you have to look at the guy who decided to test it in the real world. Block. Section 2 word count. Approximate 405 words. The man who proved this could work was Marcus, a 38-year-old mechanic living on a remote, wooded lot in northern Michigan in 2024. Marcus had bought 3 acres of raw, off-grid land specifically to escape the suburban rent trap. He spent his days clearing brush. He planned to build a traditional cabin on a fixed budget. But before he could even pour concrete footing, the local tax assessor rezoned the area. They hit him with a devastating property reassessment. The county demanded thousands of dollars in new taxes for land that barely had a dirt driveway. So Marcus stopped digging. He drove his heavy-duty truck to an industrial salvage yard on the edge of town. He handed over exactly $1,200 for a rusted but structurally sound 8 by 20-foot dual-axle flatbed trailer. Next, he contacted a regional steel supplier. He purchased a stack of dismantled, heavy-gauge Quonset arches for exactly $2,500. He did not wait for a permit. He did not hire a general contractor. He did not rent an expensive crane. Over a single, bitterly cold weekend, Marcus and 2 friends stood in the freezing mud and went to work. They hoisted the heavy corrugated steel arches using nothing but ladders and raw physical strength. They spent hours turning wrenches, driving thick zinc-coated bolts through the ribbed metal directly into the steel chassis of the trailer. Because he lived in a harsh northern climate, simply having a metal roof was not enough. Marcus understood the complex thermodynamics of cold weather survival. He executed a precise insulation sequence inside the steel shell. He sprayed 2 inches of closed cell foam directly against the cold metal. This created a seamless vapor barrier to stop condensation. Then, he layered rigid foam boards over the interior framing. This created a perfect thermal break. It allowed a tiny cast iron wood stove to keep the interior sweating hot, even when the wind chill outside dropped to 30 below zero. He finished the space with a basic 400-watt solar setup on the curved roof, a portable camping sink, and a heavy front door with a solid deadbolt. The entire project, from bare dirt to a fully insulated 160-square-foot home, cost less than $4,200. He had built a permanent, debt-free shelter that the government legally could not tax. But the system never lets a working man escape quite that easily. The county tax assessor did not celebrate Marcus's ingenuity. Instead, less than a month after the build, a white government SUV rolled up his dirt driveway. An official stepped out with a clipboard. He was ready to log the new structure onto the property tax roll and hand Marcus a massive new annual bill. Marcus walked out to meet him. He did not argue. He just pointed down at the heavy rubber tires resting in the mud. Then, he handed the assessor a piece of paper. It was not a building permit. It was a standard DMV registration for a dual-axle trailer. The bureaucracy immediately panicked. The county realized they legally could not tax the steel arches as real estate, so they shifted tactics. Within weeks, the local zoning board mailed Marcus a formal notice of violation. They tried to cite him for an unpermitted accessory dwelling. A bright orange warning was taped to his solid steel door. It threatened him with administrative fines of exactly $500 per day if the Quonset was not dismantled. A spokesperson for the county zoning commission went on the record. He called the heavy-gauge steel shelter a critical safety hazard, claiming it violated residential codes. Keep in mind, this was the exact same county that just spent 3 years trying to clear out a massive, dangerous tent encampment less than 10 miles down the road. The same local government that routinely failed to provide even basic shelter for its own people. And their immediate response to a working man who spent his own money to build a storm-proof, insulated, debt-free home was to send a truck to threaten him with financial ruin. Marcus refused to tear it down. Instead, he filmed the orange notice taped to his door. He explained his exact legal loophole on camera. When that footage hit YouTube and local news stations picked up the story, the public outrage was immediate. Working-class taxpayers from across the state flooded the county office with furious phone calls. Faced with massive public relations disaster and no clear legal ground to stand on, the county quietly backed off. They dropped the $500 daily fines. The local government tried to use a clipboard to crush a single man in the woods. But by trying to destroy his home, they accidentally broadcasted his exact legal blueprint to the rest of the country. While all of this was happening in Michigan, a completely different community was taking shape, nearly 1,000 miles south in rural Missouri. This was not a lone mechanic hiding in the woods. It was a group of combat veterans and retired factory workers, men who had been completely priced out of their own hometowns by skyrocketing property taxes. They realized that the trailer loophole was not just a desperate survival tactic for one man. It was a highly scalable blueprint. By 2025, they were not just building a single Quonset on wheels. They were building entire fleets of them. A 45-year-old warehouse worker named David started organizing weekend builds on a patch of land just outside of Springfield. He saw older men, guys who had worked manual labor their whole lives, facing immediate foreclosure because they could not afford the county's sudden tax hikes. David started sourcing heavy-gauge steel arches and used dual-axle trailer chassis at wholesale prices. He began building and selling these mobile structures to other tax-burdened men. He did it for a fraction of the market cost of a standard RV, usually keeping the total price under $3,500. Because the Quonset design relies on simple, repeating arches, the construction does not require specialized framing knowledge or expensive machinery. A team of 3 men equipped with nothing but socket wrenches, ladders, and sheer grit can bolt an entire steel shell together in exactly 48 hours. They stand in the cold dirt. They hoist the heavy corrugated panels entirely by hand. And they finish the job before the local zoning board even opens its doors on Monday morning. David told a local reporter that the demand was staggering. He has built and sold 15 of these mobile shelters so far in 2026 alone. He charges just enough to cover the raw materials. Groups of older men are now pooling their modest pensions just to buy the steel and rubber required to escape the county tax roll. He understands something that billion-dollar government housing programs continually miss. Americans facing foreclosure do not want a subsidized apartment in a crowded, concrete city complex. They want to keep their own piece of dirt, maintain their own walls, and keep the dignity of being left alone. And when you step through the heavy doors of these volunteer-built shelters, you immediately realize something striking. They are not just temporary survival pods. Walk down a dirt road on that Missouri lot today, and you will see exactly what this movement has built. It is not a grim encampment. It is a carefully organized community of 160 square-foot steel arches, all sitting quietly on heavy-duty rubber tires. When you step inside one of these units, the cold wind instantly vanishes. You do not feel like you are standing inside a legal trick. You feel like you are standing in a real home. The interior walls are lined with thick, rigid foam insulation. The floor is bolted directly to the metal chassis, layered with thick plywood and vinyl to trap the heat. A small cast iron with stove radiates from the corner. If you turn the handle on the kitchen sink, a 12-volt marine pump clicks on and delivers clean, running water. These are not flimsy recreational vehicles designed for weekend camping trips. And they are certainly not the nylon tents handed out by city emergency programs. The shell is constructed from heavy 22-gauge corrugated steel. It is specifically engineered to carry massive northern snow loads, to withstand 140-mile-per-hour hurricane winds. It does not rot, it does not mold, and it does not tear. Outside, the community aspect takes over. These men are pooling their limited resources to build a life the county said they could not afford. They share a central solar array that powers their lights and charges their batteries. They build a communal tool shed. They store the heavy wrenches and grinders they use to help new arrivals assemble their own Quonset trailers. One of the men living there is a 62-year-old former diesel mechanic named Robert. For 5 years, he bounced between his truck cab and crowded, dangerous city shelters. He had lost his previous home strictly due to skyrocketing tax assessments. Forced off a property he spent 2 decades paying off. Now he owns the space outright. He told a reporter about the first night he spent in his new shelter. He talked about the sheer physical relief of stepping inside, sliding a heavy deadbolt into place, and listening to the sound of rain hitting the thick steel roof, knowing no one could take it from him. Not glamorous, but a locked door and a warm bed beat a wet tent on concrete every single time. These men bypass the bureaucracy to build something real. But to truly understand the victory here, you have to look at the exact math of what the government was doing at the exact same time. Compare that to what happened in Austin, Texas. Look at the city's massive affordable housing and tax relief initiative. The local government allocated a staggering $300 million to stop the bleeding and keep vulnerable working-class residents on their land. According to their own official data, 3 years into the 10-year project, the results are absolutely infuriating. Instead of stopping foreclosures or pouring concrete for actual shelters, the city spent nearly $40 million strictly on outside consultants, environmental impact studies, administrative overhead. Records show that over 65% of the older residents who applied for emergency property tax relief were simply placed on a multi-year waiting list. By the time the City Council Committee finally reviewed their paperwork, thousands of those families had already lost their deeds. Lost them right to the county tax assessor. $300 million of taxpayer money. And the primary physical result was a mountain of bureaucratic reports explaining why the system was failing. In California, a similar statewide housing and tax relief initiative burned through $1.2 billion in just under 4 years. And despite that massive budget, their own records show the displacement and foreclosure numbers actually increased by 15% during that exact same window. Now, look back at that dirt road in Missouri. For exactly $4,000 in salvage materials, heavy-gauge steel, and roll rubber tires, an ordinary guy with a socket wrench is securing a permanent, storm-proof home in a single weekend. He does not need a steering committee. He does not need an environmental study or a billion-dollar municipal bond measure. That contrast tells you everything. A volunteer standing in the cold mud with a ladder and an impact driver is producing drastically better long-term outcomes than a 10-year city council committee with a bottomless budget. The government approach builds massive bureaucracies that trap people in endless paperwork. Ironically, they demand higher property taxes from the working class just to fund the very programs that continually fail to protect them. It is a completely broken, rigged mathematical loop. The state taxes you out of your home to fund a program designed to keep you in it. But the men bolting corrugated Quonset arches to flatbed trailers have finally figured out how to break that loop permanently. They realize that the only way to survive a system designed to drain you is to step outside of it completely. So, how are Americans beating the property tax trap? One bolt at a time, with their own hands. They are not waiting for a city council to pass a 10-year relief measure. They are not waiting for a new mayor to lower the county assessment rate. They are just building. They are taking raw steel, heavy rubber, and basic hand tools to create a physical loophole the system cannot close. They are sourcing salvage flatbed trailers from industrial lots. They are buying stacked Quonset arches that were originally designed to survive a world war, and they are using them to survive a modern financial crisis. Think about Marcus in the Michigan woods, or Robert in that Missouri community. Picture an older man sitting next to a hot cast iron stove, listening to the rain hit a heavy corrugated steel roof. He does not have a 30-year mortgage hanging over his head. He does not wake up terrified of a white government SUV rolling up his dirt driveway to hand him an unpayable tax bill. Instead of a traditional property deed that the county can hold hostage, he holds a simple DMV title to a vehicle. And because of that one piece of paper, he is completely, permanently debt-free. The local assessor can knock on his heavy metal door. But legally, there is nothing for the state to take. Maybe that has always been the answer. Not another billion-dollar government initiative. Not another massive, slow-moving bureaucracy. Just neighbors sharing heavy wrenches, lifting steel arches out of coal mud, and figuring out for themselves. Now, if you care about this issue and want to know how to actually execute this loophole, I put together a free guide. It is called the Tax-Free Quonset Blueprint. It covers exactly how to navigate local zoning laws, source the cheapest heavy-gauge steel, and legally register the chassis in your own state, even if you have never picked up a wrench in your life. The link is in the description below. If this video opened your eyes, hit subscribe. I cover stories like this every week, the kind that show you what is actually happening in this country when the cameras are not rolling. And click the video on screen right now. The story I covered there connects directly to what you just watched. I will see you in that one.